Today I want to talk about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And we're going to look at a passage in the Bible, 1 Samuel chapter 17. This may be quite familiar to people, and this is 1 Samuel chapter 17. It's quite a long bit of scripture, but it's really good. So let's follow this. So you can either follow it on the screens, or there are Bibles as well, if you want to follow it there. So 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Sokol in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes-dammim, between Sokol and Azekah. I wish I'd started at verse 2, that would have been easier. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley in between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span, which is about 3 meters. So very tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armour of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and the iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you are not servants of Saul? Choose a man and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." But then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight one another." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Then David, this goes on for 40 days, and we're going to skip down to verse 20 of this passage. So David goes out, he's got his brothers, Eliab and Abinadab and Shammah are fighting with Saul, so he goes to visit them. Verse 20, early in the morning David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out, as Jesse, his father, had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines, facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of the supplies, ran to the battle lines and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath the Philistine, champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. And now the Israelites have been saying, "Do you see this man? Keeps coming out. He comes to defy Israel. The king will give him great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done who kills the Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" They repeated to him what they'd been saying, and told him this is what will be done for the man who kills him. When Eliab, David's eldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him, and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are, and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. Now what have I done? You can tell that David is the younger brother, can't you? Now what have I done? Can't I even speak?" He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior since his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will become like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around, because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with the sling in his hand approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head." He doesn't lack confidence, a young David. "This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. On the 21st of August 2015, 3 young Americans got on the train from Amsterdam to Paris, the 1517 train from Amsterdam to Paris. Their names were Anthony Sadler, Alec Skalatas, and Spencer Stone. And they'd been travelling around Europe to different cities, and they were now going from Amsterdam to Paris. When the train stopped at Brussels, a man called Ayub El-Kanazi got on that train with an AK-47, a handgun, and enough ammunition to kill all 554 people on that train. Anthony and Alec and Spencer were on the front of the train, and they were listening to music, sending messages, when they saw a man in a suit sprint past them. They turned, and they saw this man, El-Kanazi, holding his rifle and beginning to shoot. And while everyone started running away, the 3 of them got into the aisle and ran towards them. The gun, this man aimed the AK-47 at them. The gun didn't go off. The 3 of them hit him, and they fought in the train carriage. Eventually, Spencer managed to get him in the jiu-jitsu hold, and they managed to restrain him. Then they discovered that one of the passengers had been shot in the neck, was bleeding from the neck, and Spencer managed to put his hand into the wound and stop the bleeding. And on that day, they saved the lives of every single one of those 554 people who were on that train. And the next day, they received a phone call from President Barack Obama, and they received the Legion of Honor from President Hollande, the highest honour in France. And later, Clint Eastwood made a film of their life. And when the reports first came out, the report was that 3 Marines, highly trained Marines, had managed to do this. But actually, it turned out that wasn't true. Anthony was a student. Alec was on a tour of Afghanistan, but he was really working on security whilst the special ops groups went out. And Spencer had tried to get into a number of different units in the army, but had failed each time and was at that time working as a janitor. And yet these ordinary people had managed to do something totally extraordinary. And we argue, but as I look out at you, I know you are extraordinary, but we are also just a group of ordinary people. But we are called to do extraordinary things. To share the gospel and see people come to know the extraordinary love of God that changes lives. We're called to build His church and see the body of Christ growing and spread throughout the world. We're called to the transformation of society, to see the homeless housed, the addicted set free, to see justice in our society. We are called to do extraordinary things, but we are very ordinary people. But how do we do that? How do ordinary people do extraordinary things? Well, the first thing, because this is a story of someone, David, very ordinary, who does something extraordinary. The first thing is to turn problems into opportunities. Goliath is a problem. He is a very big problem, he's a very well-armed problem. And all of us will be facing problems in our lives. Sometimes they are very big problems. Goliath was this huge problem. And often they seem like problems which have no solution. No one knew what to do about Goliath. It seemed like this was a problem that had no solution. No one knows what to do. We face problems that are ongoing, long-term problems. For 40 days, Goliath has been coming out to defy the people of Israel, and still they don't know what to do. And we face painful problems. The Israelites are filled with fear and dismay. Fear is this intense sense of danger. Dismay is when we are disheartened, when we lose hope, when we want to give up. And yet, whilst all the rest of the Israelites saw this as a problem, David saw this as an opportunity. And the way that we do extraordinary things is when we see the problems in our lives, and we all have all kinds of problems. Personal, in society, in global problems. When we see them not as problems, but as opportunities. Saul will actually have the opposite problem to David. Because David will emerge as the greatest opportunity of Saul's time as king. Because he's a brilliant warrior, a brilliant general, a brilliant worship leader, and totally loyal to Saul. But because Saul is jealous and insecure and self-consumed, he will turn David, this great opportunity, into a problem. So we can either be people who turn problems into opportunities, or we can be people who turn opportunities into problems. And David is someone who sees a problem and he turns it into an opportunity. That's the first thing. The second thing is we need to reassess our pasts. And David sees Goliath, and Saul says to him, "There's no way you can fight him. And David says, of course I can fight him, because I fought a lion and a bear. Now, I'm not a great expert in military matters, but I would have thought a lion and a bear present different problems to heavily armed giants. And it would be very easy for David to say, oh, there's no way I can fight Goliath. My speciality is in wild animals. This one is beyond my ability. But what David does, he looks back through his past, and he thinks, actually, what I've experienced in the past equips me for what I am facing now. But he didn't need to see things in that way. He looks through his past and thinks, God has been with me and been faithful in every challenge I've been through, so he will be with me now. But he could have seen his life very differently. He could have thought, I'm the youngest of 8 brothers. When a great prophet, Samuel, is invited to our family, I'm the one who's left out. They give me the worst task of being a shepherd. I'm often on my own, left out with the sheep. And I'm criticised by my brothers endlessly. I'm forgotten, I'm given the worst task, and then I keep on being attacked by wild animals. My life has been really tough. But instead of seeing his life like that, he sees God's faithfulness through it all. One of our friends back in Brighton, where we were before we came to Korea, who worked with me, she was also ordained, one of the clergy at St. Peter's. As she said this once, she said, of course I'm very lucky, because I was adopted. And so I've always known that I was loved and wanted. Now that's not the only way she could have interpreted her story. But she interpreted her story of adoption as a story of something that confirmed that she was always loved and always wanted. When I look back at my past, and I was ill for much of my 20s and could do very little, I can either look back at that time and think, oh, that was a time where all my friends had most energy, were having the most amount of fun, were being most social, whereas I had no energy. I was often in bed at home and was often on my own, feeling quite lonely. So I can either look at it like that, or I can think, actually that was the best illness I've ever had. And it was a time where I learned the vital lesson that God loved me even if I did absolutely nothing and saw absolutely no one. And it was a time where I got to read some interesting books and watch some high-quality television. We have a choice about how we see our past. And when Jesus comes into our life, he changes not only the way we see our present, he not only helps us to reimagine our future, he also helps us to reinterpret our past. Suddenly we see our past and everything we've been through in a different light. And because David had reassessed his past, he was ready to take on this extraordinary challenge. So see problems as opportunities. Reassess your past. Thirdly, confound the critics. Whenever you try and do anything significant, you will always receive criticism. And David here receives a lot of criticism. He's criticised, his character is criticised by his brother. Then his ability is criticised by King Saul. He says, you're too young, there's no way you can do this. Then his method is criticised by Saul. Saul says, this is how you should do it. You need this armour, this should be your method. Then Goliath attacks his spirit. He calls down curses upon him. And so David receives criticism from his family, from his boss, effectively, and from his enemies. Some of the criticism is obvious, some of it is subtle. But we all receive criticism at times in our life. And the more significant thing we try and do, the more criticism we will receive. And so we have to work out how we are going to respond to it. And what it says about David is it says he turned away from the critical voice of his brother. So I'm not going to listen to this. Brené Brown is a speaker and author, and she gave a talk, a TED talk, that went viral around the world. Millions and millions of people saw it. But with that came a huge amount of comments that came her way online, and her response, the response to her talk, some of the things that people wrote. How can she talk about worthiness and vulnerability and imperfection? These were some of the comments. How can she talk about worthiness when she clearly needs to lose 15 pounds? I feel sorry for her children. Good mothers don't fall apart. Less research, more Botox. If I look like Brené Brown, I'd embrace imperfection too. It's unbelievable, isn't it? And what she decided was that she had to work out which voices she was going to listen to in her life. And she decided that the voices she was going to listen to were the voices of those who knew her, who loved her, and were for her. She was going to listen to the voices of those who were open to feedback themselves, and those who were themselves trying their best and taking risks and stepping out there. And so we too, with the critical voices around us, and sometimes the critical voice comes from within, to think, actually, I'm going to turn away from that voice and focus on the voices I need to hear. But also, so David turns away from voices, but also he allows the criticism to turn into clarity. So every time there is a critical voice, David's able to switch it into clarity. So when Saul says, you can't do that, David thinks, actually, no, I can do this. When Saul says, this should be your method, it clarifies for David, well, no, actually, this is what my method should be. When Goliath curses David, it calls out of David this extraordinary confidence and vision for the future. And when we are criticizing, we can turn the criticism into faith, into clarity about our strategy, and into a new vision for the future. A few years ago, Tara, my wife, received some quite strong criticism from a couple of people. And these two young people said to her, well, they were actually our children, they said to her, Tara offered to play football with them, and Tara said, and they said to her, no, we don't want to play football with you, Mummy, because we will beat you easily. And just hearing that criticism called out of Tara something very, very strong. And Tara went out to play football with two of our children. And about 8 minutes later, two very dejected children walked back into our house, looking very sad, saying, Mummy beat us 7-0. And Tara feels it's important that our children experience the harsh realities of life. When we experience criticism, we respond and with faith and with clarity. And one of the reasons I think David is able to do this is all the time he spent alone on the hillside with the sheep, where he's been learning to talk to God and to hear his voice. So with all these critical voices around him, the strongest voice coming into his mind and into his heart is the voice of his Father, his Heavenly Father. And so we see problems as opportunities. We reassess our paths. We confound the critics. And then we run towards the problems. It says here that whenever Goliath appeared, the Israelites would run away from him. But David runs towards him. When we experience problems in our life, internal problems or problems around us, it can be tempting to run away, to deny there's a problem, or to avoid the problem, or just to hope it disappears. But David runs towards the problem. These three young Americans on that train, they ran towards the problem. instead of away from it. And this is what we are called to do, to run towards the problems. It can be easy to say, no, this is someone else's problem. It'd be very easy for David to say that. Because he could very easily think, well, this has nothing to do with me. I'm not even part of the army here. Or if he was, to think, surely this is Saul's problem. He's our king. He's the one who's responsible. And Goliath is their biggest champion. And Saul was a head taller than anyone else in Israel. He was their biggest person. And so David could have thought, I'm going to start a campaign to get Saul to do the thing he should be doing. But instead of doing that, he thinks, okay, I'll do it myself. I will run towards the problem. And he runs towards the problem, not in strength, but in vulnerability. He takes off his armor. And so he is vulnerable, he is defenseless, but he goes in vulnerability. And we too, when we go towards the problems in the world, we go in weakness and in vulnerability. But we also go in the knowledge that God is with us, and that is our strength. And so David has this amazing combination of vulnerability and confidence. He's not strong and confident, nor vulnerable and fearful. He's vulnerable and he's confident, because he knows that God is with him. And so God will enable him to do what he needs to do. One of the amazing things about this story of these three young Americans is just the way that God was with them on that journey. All three of them had parents who were praying for them throughout this trip. One of them, their father, was a pastor. And so they had parents praying for them and praying for them all around this time. And what was happening was extraordinary. As they travelled around Europe, they hadn't actually meant to go to Amsterdam. But it was just a part of people said, you must go to Amsterdam, you must go. So they changed their plans and got to Amsterdam. Actually, even the fact they were on this trip was a miracle, because they couldn't get their credit cards approved. And so, but suddenly, just when they came, there was a credit card that was approved, and so they could pay for this trip. Then, when they got to Amsterdam, there were loads of people who started saying to them, don't bother going to Paris. It's not really worth it. Stay in Amsterdam. And so they decided, all three of them, the night before they got on that train, they decided they were going to have an extra day in Amsterdam and were going to delay their train ride. They agreed, but then when they woke up the next morning, and they don't understand quite why, they all just knew they had to get onto that train. And so they decided to get onto the train. They got on in the middle of the train, but the Wi-Fi wasn't working. So they moved to the front of the train, where they were in the perfect position when this other man got onto the train with a gun. And when they ran towards him, the AK-47, one of the most reliable guns in the world, didn't fire. And so they were able to restrain him. The Lord was with them. And so we run towards the problems in vulnerability and in confidence. And we go with just the things that we have. For David, it was with a sling and with stones. That was what he had. And so with us, when we face all the problems around us, we think, well, okay, I can't do everything, but what do I have? I can't do this like some other people do it, but what do I have in my hands? In 1941, spring of 1941, the Italian army was trying to invade Greece, but struggling. And so the Germans stepped in, and so the 12th Army, the German 12th Army came and invaded Greece very quickly. And Athens fell, and the German army then went up to the Acropolis, this symbol of Greece, symbol of democracy, and they hung this huge swastika from the Acropolis, so it hung over the city. And it was this symbol of their oppression and of their total defeat. And there were two young students living in Athens at that time who were trying to work out what they could possibly do in response to this. They were just students after all. They couldn't take on the 12th Army. But what they could do was go to the library. And so they went to the library and they started doing some research about the Acropolis. And in their research, they discovered that there was an archaeological dig at the base of the Acropolis with a tunnel that led up to the top. So one night, they found this archaeological dig. They climbed over the barbed wire, they broke a lock, and then using some of the wood from this archaeological dig, they managed to climb up this tunnel into the Acropolis. And then when the guards were changed, they ran and they cut the cords of the swastika flag. So when Athens woke the next morning, this symbol of their oppression and their defeat had completely gone. And that moment changed the course of the history of the people of Greece, because that sparked the resistance. Suddenly, all these young men started joining the resistance and fighting in the hills. One of the men who joined the resistance was a 32-year-old shoemaker called Socrates Skalatis. And he was incredibly brave, and he was captured and then escaped again. And then eventually, after the end of the war, Socrates Skalatis managed to get to America. And he had children and grandchildren. He used to entertain his grandchildren with stories of the war. And one of his children, a man called Alec, was so inspired by the story of his grandfather during the war in Greece that when he got on a train from Amsterdam to Paris in 2015, he decided he was going to run towards the man with a gun and not away from him. We never quite know the impact of our decisions. When we just do the things we can, with the materials that we have, with what the Lord has given us, we can have an impact far greater than we could ever imagine. Now, David is a great inspiration in this story, a symbol of what ordinary people can do, the extraordinary things that ordinary people can do. But really, David was always pointing to someone who would come 1,000 years later. And actually, in this story, we are less like David and we are more like the Israelites. And we face things that are impossible for us to handle. We face sin and death. We face guilt and shame. And what happened was, 1,000 years later, one of David's descendants would come forward and he would face the giant of sin, the giant of death, the giant of injustice and shame and guilt. And he would do what none of us could do. He would do the impossible and defeat those things forever. And because of what Jesus has done for each one of us, we also can run towards the problems in our lives. We also can face the problems that each of us face. Knowing that because Jesus has faced those things and was victorious, so by the power of the Holy Spirit, we will too. Amen.